Hi, everyone. We are live. This is an unusual, but yet a special Sunday afternoon live. I am going to be interviewing Kristin Ohlson. She is the author of a book called The Soil Will Save Us. And I first learned about her and her book from watching a Netflix movie, which I highly recommend everybody watch this movie. It's called Kiss the Ground on Netflix. And if you haven't seen it, it really talks about how regenerative farming and agriculture and soil health means more than we even realize and more than scientists have ever really, understood. And that's one of the things that's so interesting about this, and that I'll talk with Kristin about, is that there are things like deep in the soil that we still don't really understand how the symbiotic relationships exist. And so when we start as humans interfering in our soil by doing things like weed killers and pest controls, we are messing with a very complicated ecosystem. And over time, we have been paying the price for that. So when we want to talk about the best ways to combat climate change, and that's something we're always talking about, and we're always talking about how to switch off of fossil fuels and how we can do better with recycling and banning plastic straws. And we're always talking about a lot of these areas, but I don't think we talk enough about the benefits of regenerative agriculture, and not just in terms of urban sustainability and helping with food deserts, but literally about the actual soil being able to not just provide, if we keep it healthier, more nutritious food, less expensive over time because you're not having to spend money on pesticides and weed killers. But when we start talking about a soil that is capable of enduring things like droughts and floods. And right now we don't have that. Right now we've got soil that's essentially sand. And when it floods, it floods. It also rinses all the nitrates and chemicals off of the soil into our water supply because the soil isn't absorbing enough. And that has to do with soil health. So there's a lot of things that we can gain from repairing our soil. And it's something that we can just all do. And really, there are some big problems. We'll talk about what the hurdles are, and I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised that our big hurdles are things like big agriculture and lobbying and the money that goes behind subsidizing our farmers to continually monocrop and not participate in regenerative agriculture. So we need to start talking about basically forcing our elected officials to engage with this. So Kristin's here, so I'm going to bring her on. This is Kristin Ohlson. She is the author, and we've never met. So this is kind of this is going to be interesting, exciting, and I feel I'm very prepared. I've got highlights and notes, so I'm like, I think I'm good. But so anyway, I'm going to bring in Kristin. We'll say hi.
Hi.
Hi. How are you?
I'm fine. It's sunny here in Portland. It's a nice day.
Wait. Portland, Oregon.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. So no wonder you care so much about the environment. You're not from the Florida region. That's that makes sense to me now.
I think that there are people everywhere that care about what's going on out there. I did a lot of the research for this book and wrote part of it when I was living in Ohio. So, there's some amazing farmers in Ohio doing great regenerative work on the land.
Yeah. So, I just want to do like a brief sort of intro. I told everyone where I heard of you was first from the movie on Netflix, the Kiss the Ground movie. And then I was like fascinated by this. So then I had to go learn everything. And then I read your book and so on. But I don't know if you're at all familiar with what we're doing or what we're about. Because you were just kind of like contacted by me out of the blue. Like, I don't know. It's probably not something that happens very often. Much to my concern is that not enough media people and people with platforms are seeking this information and giving it a big voice. And to me, that's very important. I ran for Congress in August in the primary against Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And we are now just continuing with our platform in terms of doing service and providing education and really trying to build coalitions to really, work with progress both inside the political system and outside the system. So one of the big things we talk about, obviously, is climate crisis. And that's a huge concern for us in Florida. We obviously have like major saltwater encroachment, and all these things, sea level rise. And this is something that nobody here ever talks about. We talk about solar, we talk about all sorts of solutions, and no one ever talks about this. And yet it seems like the most basic, simplest thing we can do. And so I want to just start with that. Like, what is it that we have never understood as people that have created the system that we're stuck in now, like this vicious cycle that we are now?
Oh God, where to begin?
Well, I mean, I'm just talking in terms of like how we just do not understand the symbiosis of what goes on.
Right. I mean, I think that we humans suffer from a very human-centric view, and we do all this stuff in the landscapes around us for our benefit, and we don't ever realize that throughout those landscapes around us, there are all these relationships among living things that hold those landscapes together, that hold our planet together. And so that's kind of the story behind agriculture. You know, as long as humans have done agriculture, it has disrupted nature to a certain extent. But in the last century, especially, that kind of impact that we have had on the rest of nature. And I always say the rest of nature because we're nature too. You know, we didn't come out of a box. We are nature too. We have these relationships with microorganisms inside us and on us, and those are all very essential. But what we've done with agriculture is simplify landscapes to make it easier for us to manage them. And in doing that, we have created completely dysfunctional landscapes. So in a more natural landscape, in a landscape that humans haven't tinkered around with so much, there's a relationship, an ongoing essential relationship among plants and microorganisms that are in the soil, microorganisms that are in their leaves, relationships among plants and other animals. But we simplify all of that to do agriculture. You know, we create these monocultures, which are vast fields that are emptied of every living plant except for the one plant that we want to grow. And what we do when we simplify these landscapes, and especially in agriculture, is that we change. There's a natural. You know, we talk a lot about climate change and there being an excess of carbon in the atmosphere. You know, and we only tend to think of the carbon as coming from the burning of fossil fuels. But I think before 1850, I think that's the right date. Before that date, before we really ramped up the burning of fossil fuels, most of the carbon that was in the atmosphere came from burning forests, you know, the way that we use soil. So in a healthy natural environment, plants are conducting photosynthesis and they're pulling carbon out of the air and they're turning it into their own fuel. They're turning it into sugar that they use to grow. And what they're doing also. So we've understood that for a long time. But what we've really just started to understand in the last couple of decades in an important way, and it's so crucial for understanding how to deal with climate, is that plants also take that carbon fuel that they've created and send it down into their roots where they share it with microorganisms in the soil. And because they're sharing, it's a carbon syrup, they're sharing that carbon syrup with those soil microorganisms. Those microorganisms eat that syrup and use that syrup and wind up building up carbon in the soil. So that's what makes dark, rich soil, that especially, you know, if we go out into a forest or if we go out into a place that humans haven't used over and over and over and we dig up the soil, it's black and rich and crumbly and it smells good. That's the carbon in there. That's the carbon in that's making it dark, that's making it crumbly. So what we do with agriculture, most conventional agriculture, is that we destroy that.
Right. I mean, we hear of it, and even I had heard of things like we hear of no-till farming, obviously less damage to the soil. But there are still a whole host of other like aspects of this besides that. And there are farmers that are maybe they're doing no-till, but they're not necessarily really working the best. I guess the best relationship between what I guess you call it between the animal husbandry and how it works with it, like the connection between how we raise our livestock and how we raise our crops, and not keeping those separate. And I think I believe you in your book, you talked about when that was realized. And I think it was in Africa, where it was a matter of, how come the grass is so good there? Oh, because there's herding animals that are migrating and moving, and this whole exchange between movement of animals and the growing of the plants. And here we obviously separate those things completely. We put livestock in giant corrals on dirt that don't contribute in any way, shape, or form to helping, and only contribute to hurting the atmosphere. And then we use pesticides and fertilizers for our crops and keep them completely separate from our cattle.
Right.
So I mean, explain.
Yeah, remember the farms that some of us used to sing about when we were kids. Old MacDonald had a farm, yes. And there were, chickens and ducks, and, we always assumed trees and plants and all that kind of stuff. So yes, when there was a big push from government and industry in this country to make farms more efficient and productive, and basically create these vast amounts of commodity products that the U.S. can trade all over the world, those smaller farms that combined all those things, they would have animals and plants, and they would be a great diversity of species there. Those small farms kind of came to an end, not completely, but that is one thing that a lot of the most visionary farmers are doing now is bringing back the ones who just had crops. They're bringing animals back on their land, or they're using their animals in a different way.
So what is the history of that in terms of the modern movement of regenerative agriculture in this country? Like, where can we see, like, where are there good examples where it is being used in this country? Because this isn't new news. Just nobody's talking about it. Like, this is information that's been around for a long time, right?
Well, has it been around for a long time? I mean, there's some of this that's, the whole organic movement earlier in the 20th century, that the Rovdale Institute was the most prominent spokes group of, the organic movement that was, back in, I think, in the 40s, and then picked up steam again in the 60s and 70s. I mean, that movement had some of the principles that regenerative, what I call regenerative agriculture, but it's called other things. There are parts of the world where indigenous farmers have been farming in very healthy ways for a long time, and we tend to call that agroecology. In some countries, it's called natural farming. I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at, there's a lot of names for this kind of ecological farming, this farming that takes into account a respect, that builds on a respectful relationship with the rest of nature. I think that what was lacking in the organic movement, even as recently as the 60s and the 70s, was this understanding of the life in the soil.
Right.
People would talk about the soil being alive, but really nobody had the full scope of understanding. And that's what the modern science and the modern tools and all of that are really providing us now, is a look into the soil at all these incredibly dynamic and important relationships that are going on in the soil, of bacteria and fungi and microarthropods and protozoa and all these things that are in the soil, and sort of have a relationship with each other, and with the plant. It's kind of like if you think of the roots of a plant, every single plant as being a big city, a Paris or a Rio de Janeiro or a Mexico City or a New York City, with all these things living there, and all of them having different roles and playing and bringing something new and good and important to the transactions that are going on there. So I think that was what was missing in the organic movement, and what we in this country call regenerative agriculture. It benefits from the more modern science that looks at those incredible relationships that are going on in the soil, and also, in the book that I'm working on now, which is about cooperation in nature and looking at all these relationships everywhere.
Yeah.
It's not just in the soil; it's on the leaves of plants. It's on our skin. Everything is in relationship with this hidden microbial world.
I don't know that people love to hear about that so much, right? We got some serious germaphobes, especially nowadays with everything going on. So if we can get an understanding of the importance of, what's in the soil, I wanted to do this because I know so many people that would love this information that I know are never going to read the book. They're not going to read the book. They're just not. And so I kind of feel like I'm offering them The Soil Will Save Us for Dummies version right now, just sort of like breaking it down so that everybody can at least understand what is in this without having to do that. And
watch the movie. The movie's easy to watch.
Oh, and I always tell everybody to watch the movie, but the movie isn't, it's broader in a lot of ways, and it's not as specific as your book gets in a lot of ways as well. But what I garnered there are so many benefits from having healthy soil beyond what's even just common sense. So obviously it is better for our food source. Healthier soil, healthier food, it makes sense. But talk a little bit about, or would you talk a little bit about how having a moisture-rich soil protects us from some of the effects of climate crisis that we're starting to see, whether it's droughts and floods, and how does soil health help us deal with those issues?
Right. Yeah. That is, and lest I forget to say this later on, healthy soil, this whole healthy soil movement has a huge impact on the biodiversity crisis around the world. So I'll get to that later. But so basically what happens when plants make that carbon-rich syrup, and they send it down through their roots to feed the soil microorganisms. The soil microorganisms, billions in the soil, billions in a teaspoon of soil. They take that carbon syrup and they feed themselves, and they also make a kind of carbon glue and make themselves little habitats in the soil. So they'll take that glue and make tiny little pockets to move water and moisture around, to make tiny protective habitats for themselves. This is bacteria and fungi and other things. And with those pockets that they're making in the soil, you have to think of the soil as not being, we talk about standing on hard ground, standing on solid ground, and really the soil is not solid. It's got billions and billions of these tiny little pockets. Healthy soil has billions and billions of these tiny little pockets. Think of a sponge or a coral reef. That's the kind of image that we should have in mind when we think of what healthy soil is like, because of that action of the soil microorganisms using that carbon syrup. So because they're creating soil that's full of all these little pockets, when it rains, the soil sucks that in and it holds that rain in those pockets. So if there's a torrential rain that, that is unusual, and so many of us are getting those torrential rains now because
we're in one right now. We've been flooded in Florida.
Yeah, the weather is so weird. So when soil is healthy like that and has all those pockets from those microorganisms, it holds onto that rain. It's what Alan Savory, who's the one who really led the movement towards regenerative grazing or holistic grazing. He calls that effective rainfall. It doesn't do you any good if it rains and the rain hits the ground, which is so hard and so non-porous that it just runs off into the streams and into the rivers, and and washes away topsoil, washes away the chemicals on the topsoil. So that rain doesn't do us any good. But effective rain that the ground is able to soak up and hold there, that is the kind of rain that really does us a lot of good. So you can see that kind of soil protects us when there's a deluge, a downpour, and cuts back on the risk of flooding, but it also protects us when there's a drought. When it doesn't rain for a long time, if the soil is there and it's still holding water from the last time it rained, and those mycorrhizal fungi, the fungi that are in the soil that are working with the plant roots, but also stringing these thread-like hyphae through all the soil. The soil underneath our ground, it's like knit together. There's like a tapestry underneath our feet of these mycorrhizal fungi holding. So they are distributing water throughout the whole system. So that healthy soil really protects us when there's a drought.
Okay, so also one of the things that people will talk about is the cost. We get a lot of people that'll say things like, well, that's not affordable. We can't do that. That'll cost too much money. And I wanted to talk about something that you said here that I thought was really interesting, which is patience capital, which I thought was a really good term regarding that there is obviously probably like a growing pains period between transitioning over. But then once you do that, this actually will produce more crops for less money is how it works. Yeah.
The farmer that I focused on, my sort of showcase farmer in the book is a man named Gabe Brown in North Dakota. And he found, and he was sort of driven he was a conventional farmer, got a degree in agriculture, was taught to use the chemicals and to do the tilling and to do all the stuff that is in the playbook of conventional agriculture, things that he would never do now. But he started off that way, and he was failing that way because it's such a stress on the land. And
you're talking about just in general, how we monoculture and how we do everything. And then we cut everything down and then there's just dirt and there's nothing left to feed the soil. Like just our whole method of industrial agriculture.
Right.
Basically, you have to keep moving from one plot until the next plot and the next one. You just keep killing off the land.
Right. And we keep using chemical, I think that we have the idea that the chemicals that we use, that there's some very loud music coming in. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm dealing with an annoying dog, so.
Okay. I've got two annoying dogs, but they're asleep. We generally believe what's written on the label, that these products only are for this purpose and that they don't screw up everything else. But those chemicals affect everything.
Uh-huh.
So anyway, I was before I was interrupted by the loud music. I was talking about Gabe Brown, this farmer in North Dakota, who was sort of forced to change his agricultural method because he was failing and he actually couldn't afford all those chemicals and he couldn't afford to use his tillage equipment. He couldn't afford a lot of that stuff. And so for like 4 years, he couldn't do any of that stuff. And instead of having his heavy machinery clean out his fields at the end of the season, he would send his cattle in to eat up the ruined remnants of what was there. One year his crops were killed by hail, one by drought, it was just all these things. Anyway, so he is he's probably the most famous example of a farmer who's doing all of this stuff. He realized, with the help of a soil scientist, a soil microbiologist, and a conservationist, he realized that he could encourage the same productivity from his land without using all those chemicals and without using all that tillage, if he just sort of understood better what was happening biologically. And so he's been doing that now for, gosh, how long is it now? Over probably 25 years. Yeah. And what he found quite soon was that as his soil got healthier and healthier, his production was above the county average, but he was spending way less to grow that food. So he was actually so much more profitable than the farmers around him who were using, the chemicals and the heavy tillage and the GMO seeds and all that. So, and I think that is what more and more farmers are finding, and they're becoming, it's really fun to watch. They're becoming so creative and also so excited about seeing this response from nature, where they, some of these regenerative grazers who are doing things very differently, they're starting to see wildflowers that haven't been seen in their area for 30 years. They're seeing the land really respond dramatically to the steps they've taken.
Yeah, amazing when you actually try your best, given where we are now, to put things back to some semblance of where it was supposed to be anyway, and just let things take their own course. It's fascinating to see that. And this brings me to the problem with this is that when something like that becomes affordable, you start angering the powers that be. And one of the biggest problems that I see as a roadblock with a lot of this stuff is big agri, and dealing with companies like Monsanto and big special interests that essentially try to penalize farmers for going this route in different forms. And so I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about where we are now in terms of the subsidies that we're doing. And then also I wanted to talk a little about this idea of crop insurance, which seems to me like another way to penalize farmers for not using Monsanto product. And I don't know if it all comes down to Monsanto or if it's just that whole industry or what. But because when we're talking about something that benefits us, benefits farmers, and yet is so hard to get put through, I have to wonder what's the roadblock. And I just see lobbying and special interests across the board.
Yeah, there are so many roadblocks. One of the roadblocks is the farming community. It's hard for people to change, and especially it's hard for people to change when their livelihood is right there and they want to do what they think is a sure thing. So they'll continue to do the same thing over and over again. And, we have to realize that for 40 or 50 or 60 years, the farming community has been hit with these messages from the land grant colleges, from the academic infrastructure, the ag infrastructure there in academia, from industry representatives, from government, that this is the best way to be successful. Use these chemicals. This is the best way to be scientific and modern. Use these chemicals. Use these highly engineered seeds. So it's and I think that there's there's a tradition of what a farm should look like, not just for us, not just for us wanting a pretty picture of a farm, but for farmers themselves. They want their farm to look neat and tidy and pretty. And these regenerative farms don't look like that. They look a little wild and crazy because, for instance, if somebody is growing corn, well, they might also be growing, on a typical conventional farm, the rows of corn are every 3 feet, spaced every 3 feet. And on a conventional farm, there's just like a road,
like dirt. It's just dirt rows.
On one of the regenerative farms, though, that space in between can be filled with 15 different kinds of wildflowers. Oh, so many other things. And those are called cover crops. And when they're grown alongside the main crop, they're called companion crops. So those are grown there to protect the soil, to keep the soil from eroding, but also to draw in a community of insects. They want to draw in a broad community of insects that'll eat, which includes predator insects that'll eat pest insects. They want to draw in a broad community of pollinators. They want from all those, so it's when they have all those different, very different plants growing in there, all those different plants it's kind of like a potluck. When you go to a potluck, 15 people might make chili. But everybody has a slightly different recipe, and that's the way it is with all those different plants that are exuding those carbon sugars into the soil microorganisms. They're all exuding a slightly different recipe to the soil microorganisms. So, there are issues within the farming community about making change, and just human beings. We have a hard time making change. There is a lot of pressure on farmers from in farming communities, the people who sell fertilizer and heavy equipment and all that stuff. They are big presences there. So there's a lot of pressure on people to buy the latest thing and try the latest thing. And the way our system of government funds agriculture, it is, and that's a hugely complicated topic. And I wrote an article, 4 or 5 years ago about how one regenerative farmer was penalized and lost his crop insurance because he was following some of the practices that regenerative agriculture encourages, but because it changed the rigid schedule that he was supposed to follow with his crop insurance for getting rid of what they call weeds and what he was calling cover crops. He lost his crop insurance. So there are rules within crop insurance that penalize farmers for taking creative. They're not even really risks. These are kind of sure things that would help them. But
so it's essentially, the idea of crop insurance to me, like as somebody who I guess I'm just cynical in this way when I see things like that. To me, that is a way for these bigger companies to force farmers to use their products by making it that their insurance rates are higher if they don't use their products. Like, I mean, that's just... I mean, I'm not even remotely surprised by that, but
there's a lot of course, there's so much influence on every single government agency that we have from big moneyed interests. And that's certainly one. Yeah,
it's just unfortunate because we're talking about something. And so just like to remind people who, especially anybody who's just coming on, there are so many benefits to healthy soil. It protects our land from climate crisis issues like floods and droughts. It creates healthier, better crops. There's long-term financial savings. I mean, it's really a win-win-win. But could you explain how it works with the cows? Like explain how we know that when we move them around as opposed to letting them sit in one place, it actually helps. I mean, I know it has something to do with the hooves and the poop.
Hooves and poop, super important. So if you think about the way these big herds of animals used to move over the land before we interfered with them. So think of the bison. They used to move across the plains. They would bunch in close together because there were predators out there. There were mountain lions, there were wolves, there were humans. There were, so it behooved them, which sounds like a weird pun, but it made sense for them to sort of stay sort of tightly grouped. But it also made sense for them to keep moving, not only to keep moving away from predators, but because they didn't want to be feeding right where the herd had pooped. So
Right.
they would keep moving in this very bunched together fashion, moving over the landscape. So when humans came along and started domesticating these grazing animals, well, what did we do? We didn't want predators to come and take them. So we either put shepherds out there with dogs to chase away the predators, or we would put these animals in fences so that they couldn't move around and so that we could sort of guard the exterior. Well, then how did that change the way the animals moved over the land? So instead of moving along all the time, eating some of the grass and the forbs and the other things that were growing there. Forbs are like flowers and other things. So when the herds used to move along that way, they would not only eat, and they probably wouldn't even eat half of the stuff that was growing there. They would eat a third of the stuff that was growing there and trample on the rest of it. So all of that stuff, it turns out, is hugely important ecologically. When they eat, they pull on the roots of a grass, and it causes the grass plant, which in those prairie areas have very long roots, like 15 feet roots. So they cause that grass plant to sort of pulse carbon sugars out through the roots, pulse them out, and then when they start to grow, and when the cows or the bison bit off the top, some of the roots would die off and leave that carbon in the soil. So the bison biting on the plant would pulse carbon into the soil. Their hooves would push down other grasses so that the soil microorganisms could eat them, get close to them and eat them. They would leave these pock marks in the soil so that new seeds so that water would pool in the hoof prints. And so all of that stuff was hugely ecologically important. But when we fenced them in and guarded them, they didn't have to behave like that. They could sort of wander out and stay in one area for a very long period of time. And if there was something growing there that they really liked, they would just eat it and eat it and eat it and eat it until they had just pulled it up by the roots and there was nothing left. So it would create these big bare areas. And that's the beginning of the death of soil, is if there's no roots in the soil pulsing carbon down into it, those soil microorganisms die. So that's sort of the whole idea about how we changed grazing, how we changed the way those animals behave. And the ranchers now who are trying to incorporate these regenerative principles into the way they raise animals, they are sort of trying to replicate the behavior of those old herds. So they have, instead of having one enormous field that they just turn the cattle into for the whole year, they have that one big field divided up into maybe 100 smaller paddocks. And they move the animals through those paddocks every 2, 3, 4 days. Depending on what the state of the grasses are.
Yeah. And this is so interesting because generally, and what I love so much about this whole concept is how it really does bring together people that would otherwise not be on the same team. Specifically when we talk about like environmentalists and ranchers, mostly I know environmentalists are pretty anti-ranching. They, because we tend to think of ranching as clearing away everything and the way we treat our animals and all of it. I mean, it's a travesty. So, this is something that could actually allow for building a coalition. And I like something that you said. So I have to quote this. You called it the Boots and Birkenstocks bunch. It pleases me because I lived in Texas for 6 years, so I can I can picture the exact combination of people of whom you're speaking. But I think that that's a really important issue, that we have to be on the same page with people as opposed to being so anti-ranching, anti-meat consumption, anti-that, because we actually need the cattle.
Right. And I think one of the things that was so cheering for me about writing this book was to find out that those coalitions really are developing. I don't think there's any major environmental group now, and probably no minor environmental group, that's not in conversation, doing active work with farmers and ranchers, because they understand, it's millions and millions and millions of acres that farming and ranching occupy, and so it's and those people love their land. That's the thing that's great, is those people actually love their land. They have been convinced, again, by ag school, academia, industry representatives, government representatives. They've been convinced over the last 50 years that what they have to do to their land to be able to hang on to it, to be able to be productive, is to poison it. And it's so exciting for me when I'm talking to some, like this one rancher that I interviewed. He talked about changing the way he was working on the land purely from a profit perspective, purely because he thought he could make more money and the land would be more resilient and all of that. But then he started noticing all the bird life that hadn't been there before. And then he started noticing all the plant life that hadn't been there before. And he became kind of like this, citizen naturalist.
Yeah, I think, and for me, there's always a different hook for a different group or a different person, like whatever is your reason, whether it's you want to help save the planet or you want to protect yourself from flood damage or, whatever your reason is. That's what's so cool about this is there's so many positives. And the one we haven't really talked about, which is, I think, not necessarily controversial, but not as, I think people don't know about this, is the concept of carbon sequestration. Mm-hmm. And that the soil can actually help us pull the carbon emissions out of the air and store it in the soil so as to not just make soil healthy for going forward, but to also sort of help clean up the mess we've already made.
Right.
And that's an interesting angle.
Yeah. I mean, we can, and that was the whole concept that got me going with this book. I was talking to, the book I got started on this book because there's this chef who was, a farmer's market. He had helped build up the sort of the pipeline between local farms and farmers markets and his restaurant back in Cleveland when I worked there. And so I had written about him and I would always call him up and say, what's new? What's new in the progressive farming circuit? And one day he said, carbon farming. That's what all these young farmers are talking about. Carbon farming. It's like how to put more carbon into the soil. And, I was just so blown away by that idea. I thought, oh my God, that has to be part of the solution to our climate crisis is to get the carbon in the soil. So that is what, it's not what all of these farmers are thinking about, but I think all of these farmers are pleased. They're pleased that their bottom line is better. They are pleased that their land is more resilient, that their land doesn't flood. They are pleased to see wildlife return. They are pleased to see their insect pests decrease. They're pleased about all this stuff, but many of them are also really pleased to be part of the answer to this big existential crisis that we have about how to help our planet return to one in which carbon is in balance. Carbon is not a bad thing. It's the element that's necessary for life, but we've got too much of it in the atmosphere and not enough in the soil. So we need to get that back into the soil where it belongs.
And I found this to be a very interesting number is that you said if only 11% of the world's cropland that is typically not in use improved its community of soil microorganisms as much as they did in the test plots, I guess, referring to the what you were looking at, the amount of carbon sequestered would offset all of our current emissions of carbon dioxide. So you're basically saying 11% of the world's cropland were to adopt this type of carbon agriculture. It would hold off where we are right now in terms of our carbon emissions.
Well, that's what one scientist theorized. Yeah, and he's been working on these. He's just such a great guy. He's been doing this work for, I don't know, 20 years or so.
So then we come to, how do you measure it? And then how do you compensate farmers for it? Because I also know that was something where you said that the ranchers and the environmentalists were coming together against people wanting to then come in and develop, because then when you were to come in and develop and dig it up, you're releasing the carbon back up into the air, right? Mm-hmm. So there needs to be incentive once we have this carbon in the soil to keep it there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and that is one of the tricky things, and that is something that I think we have to approach through the way government subsidize, the way government supports agriculture. That there has to be something in the Farm Bill, something that runs throughout our government policies of supporting farmers or penalizing them if they are not building carbon in the ground and keeping it in the ground, which means there are sort of some basic principles of regenerative agriculture. One is, not to have bare soil, is to have the soil covered at all time, either with a live root or with dead plants that still protect the soil and give the soil microorganisms something to chew on. Another is no monocultures, try to keep try to mimic nature as much as possible by having a variety of plants in the soil.
Yeah, we need to incentivize. I always say that, this isn't complicated. You have to incentivize the good behavior and penalize the bad behavior. And right now, and people know this in theory, I mean, I even knew this, we subsidize farmers to be growing mostly corn, soy, the top few things that they all do that goes to feed lots, to feed meat that's living in lots and not helping regenerate the agriculture. So we're doing it all wrong.
Right. We are doing it all wrong. I mean, yeah, we subsidize a few commodity crops, and, for feedlot cattle, for ethanol, for all those horrible derivatives that come out of corn, fructose corn syrup and a whole range of food additives. Yeah, I mean, we do our agriculture very badly. And so we're trying to promote that all over the world.
Well, yes, because we're saving them from themselves. Those tribal people really needed us to come in and show them how to work with the land better. That's what they needed. So what are we looking for from a political perspective in our policy? Like, what can I tell people, or what can viewers know? Because this is the stuff that people don't even pay attention to. Nobody's paying attention to it. Nobody notices it. It's not a sexy subject, but I think we really need to know in terms of policy, what should we be pushing our representatives to be doing in our policy that would promote this?
Yeah. I am lucky here in Oregon because our Congressman 𝘚𝘰𝘪𝘭𝘵 has really been focusing on how to change the farm bill, what's the proper way for taxpayers to support agriculture that leads to not only healthier food, but a healthier landscape. And I think he has that stuff on his website. I know that I've lost track, but I think there might be 14 states now that have passed soil health legislation. So,
okay. So that is something that some states are, because again, I'm in Florida. We will be we'll be underwater, so it won't be a problem for the rest of you, but we're just so far behind in terms of anything progressive here. And the other thing that I'm very interested in is the idea of inspiring municipal composting and why more places aren't doing that. And again, we'll be the last people to do that. You'll probably be amongst the first. But can you talk a little bit about how at a local level, maybe the different things? I mean, I just think composting, it comes off the top of my head, but the things we can do locally that people can really do that would really help with soil health, whether it's in their own homes or, pursuing it with your city commissions, or what we can do.
Yeah, I mean, municipal composting is a great example, and we do that in Portland.
Of course you do.
We do. It's just insane to take all our food waste and put it in a landfill where it just generates bad gases, when we could make that into a soil amendment. So that is something to push for locally.
Okay.
It's not just, I think that we have to think really broadly about not just changing our farming. I think we have to change generally how we interact with nature in all of our landscapes. So even in cities, we should make city parks places that are chemical free and that, aspire to these principles of the soil being covered, of there being lots of species. I think that we, in cities, again, we should city parks and gardens and all that can also be water sinks instead of having water, coursing down the streets and then off into a pipe where it gets dumped somewhere.
Yeah.
Cities themselves can be much healthier, more ecological places for us and for wildlife. In a lot of cities are really working on improving the urban landscape for wildlife, especially because the farming outside of the cities can be so bad, can be so toxic that, wildlife has to have some place to breed and eat and all of that.
Yeah, we also have in urban environments food deserts, which is another problem and something that we see with what's happening with climate crisis is that our Black and brown communities, our vulnerable communities are going to bear the brunt of that impact. Those are the first people that lose when there's a supply chain problem or any such issues. And so, one of the things that I am working with a community partner in is building a community garden in one of our vulnerable communities. And I love the idea of doing it as regenerative, as making it almost like a prototype or a model, because we really don't have stuff like that around here. And nothing that's sponsored by any real municipality. We have a community garden in my town. Nobody takes care of it. And then when I called to offer a whole group of volunteers, I was told, no, we're on a 2-year contract and there's somebody already taking care of it. Meanwhile, it's completely just destroyed. There's nothing happening there. So, even municipalities where they have something on the books that says a community garden, they're not necessarily really doing anything with those things. So I think people need to understand that it is incumbent upon all of us to be very proactive with this. We do in Florida now have the ability to grow produce on our front lawns. Front lawns can be gardens now for us. I know the rest of the country's been there for a long time. That's
not always. No, I think
always.
That is just great.
Yes. People don't know it, but it's true. We can grow vegetables and produce on our front lawns here.
And that is so good for us in so many ways. I mean, not only that we eat the food, but, as I said before, we all have this constant interface with the microbial community. We have microbes all over our skin. We require microbes to circulate through us. When we work on the land, when we grow things, when we dig in the soil, we are sort of replenishing that connection with the rest of nature that our bodies really need.
Yeah, there's something really good about gardens and communities and bringing people together and just getting your hands in the dirt. And there's so many positives. We're actually looking here to create a diversion program for juveniles, both through the schools and even with the state attorney's office, where we'll do a working on our farm, and our sustainable agricultural little community will be part of a diversion program. Great. Yeah, which I think is really cool. So finally, I just want to wrap it up for people. We talked about the importance of our soil and how it can really save us from different parts of climate crisis, how our food will be better, how farmers, it can be more affordable for them. Politically, we need to be looking for soil amendments and different things in our farm bills that subsidize regenerative agriculture and not monoculture in the way we've done things. But what are our economic implications? Where should we best allocate I always consider my wallet my vote in a lot of ways in terms of what industries we support and who we choose to give our money to. And how can we really be confident that when we're saying, oh, we're buying organic this or organic that, what's the best way for us to know how to spend our money and reward the best behavior in this industry?
That's a tough one. I mean, I am lucky in that the grocery stores that I shop at, I know how they source. I pay attention to how they source. I ask them how they source. If they say that something is organic, I have to ask them sometimes, well, wait, do you mean, is it grown in soil or was it grown hydroponically? Because I don't want it if it's hydroponically grown. I want it to come out of the soil. And in the stores where I shop, And I think this is very much an Oregon thing, that I can ask them what farm their meats came from.
Yeah, that's an Oregon thing.
It is an Oregon thing. I think you can do that also if you're lucky enough to have a farmer's market. And God, I think anything that we can do to support farmers markets and CSAs, to support actual small farmers who are trying to make a living and buy from them, that's a great thing to do. But honestly, I try to do that as much as I can, but honestly, we can't change things until we change policy.
Yeah.
We can't change it piecemeal. I can feel good about spending my money at the farmer's market. But we really have to change the whole system and change it. It's not, I think before we can change the whole system, we have to really change the way that we think about how we interact with the rest of nature, that we cannot continue to stress and rupture these environments around us without having incredible costs for all the things that matter for us.
Yeah. I think that's so true. I noticed it a few years ago when I was living in San Antonio. We had this wasp problem in front of my house. We had these red-tailed wasps, and they were driving me crazy, and they're by the front door, and I had to get rid of the wasps. And so we got rid of the wasps, and the next thing you know, we have webworms that have taken over all of our trees because that's what the wasps used to eat. So now there's nothing eating the webworms, and the webworms are covering the trees. So I sort of watched, and that was my own little what happens when you tinker with the natural flow of things. That's what happens. You end up with a tree full of webworms, and which are quite gross. I, in retrospect, preferred the wasps to the webworms. You never know. It's sort of like you never know what you're going to get once you start messing with stuff. It's like you start substituting something for something else. But I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for coming on. Is there something that you are working on that you would like to promote or put out there, or other books or other projects?
Well, I am working on another book, but it won't be out. It's the company Patagonia is publishing it. The clothing company, the outdoor clothing company Patagonia. But it won't be out until I think spring of 2022.
Oh, okay. So we have time on that.
I can't promote it yet.
Okay. But so is your most recent book is The Soil Will Save Us?
Yeah.
Okay. So that, because I come onto things sometimes a little later than, like, I'm not necessarily quick on the uptake. So it could be one of those things you're like, yeah, I wrote that 10 years ago. Where have you been? I've written 3 books since then, so I just have to make sure. So, Peter, I know you're watching. Please just put the title and the stuff in the chat. The Soil Will Save Us. And this is Kristin Ohlson. And thank you so much for coming on and doing this. Oh, I had one question from somebody that you may or may not even know the answer to, which is it true that Monsanto is pushing legislation to make it illegal for farmers to not use their seeds? Or did that already go into effect?
Farmers that use their seeds, when they open the package, they are in effect signing a contract to not reuse those seeds. So, yeah, it didn't take legislation. It's the way.
It's just okay, so it's not a law. It's just their binding agreement within their sales packaging that once you buy it, this is what you're subscribing to. So it's a private agreement. It's not legislation. So that answers Justin's question there. So I appreciate it so much. And please check us out. And this is, since we did this live, it'll just, I think it'll just be up. And everybody,
okay,
like button. Thank you so much, Kristin. It was so nice to meet you.
And thank you for your work. Your work just sounds great, and good luck to you.
I'm just trying to look, this is part of what we're, when you say what we have to do is we have to change our priorities, and we have to change how we view things. And the way you do that is by educating as many people as possible about these issues. And I have this big platform now, so I'm going to use it. And so now there's this many more people that know they need to be concerned about the soil health, which we all do. And it will be especially helpful in Florida. And I just think this is stuff people need to know. And I'm also kind of nerdy. So like I'll find something and just go down some rabbit hole and then, have to know even more about it. And you just sort of got stuck in my rabbit hole.
It's a good rabbit hole.
It is. Thank you so much, Kristin. It was nice talking to you.
Good to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Bye. So that was really cool. And I actually really do encourage people to understand the complexity of this. This is a serious situation with our soil, and we're seeing it affect us more and more. And it is. We're being bullied off of our soil by big agri. And I know that there is a very good local community here that does deal with local farms and organic seeds and not having to. You're so annoying, Sophie. But yeah, we all need to be looking for soil amendments. We need to be looking for subsidizing farmers in the correct way. And we need to be, in general, really trying to build coalitions between all the people that would best benefit from this, which is everybody. So I reached out to a friend of mine who is actually somebody who owns a grass-fed beef company and is actually very big beef cattle grass-fed beef company. And he is also working on a book that he's writing about regenerative agriculture. And maybe I'll get him to come on at some point too, because it really does show you that there is this mutual beneficial relationship between crops and cattle. And if we can really work that out, and I know it asks a lot of the vegans to not be just, haters on the meat so much. I mean, it's never going away in this country. It's just not. And so the best thing that we really need to do is do it as organically and as beneficially as we can to all of us. And as humanely as we can, which, by the way, regenerative agriculture is infinitely more humane to the animals than any sort of livestock corral feedlot things. So anyway, I'm going to check out. Everybody, thank you so much for coming on and watching this interview with Kristin. She was great. And check out her book and watch the movie, Kiss the Ground. Peace out, all.